So today's subject, as it was voted in, is interaction design, and I'm joined by Richard Yang, who's a fellow Facebooker, but on top of that, he's ex Sony, worked on PlayStation, has done a lot of other really interesting design projects and startups and stuff. Richard, can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. Thanks, Jerry. Hi, guys. My name's Richard. I'm also a designer at Facebook, working on Facebook NPE, which is kind of like our incubator program. Before that, I was a designer at Shopify doing the same thing. And then, like Jerry mentioned, I also worked at PlayStation on the side. I worked on a lot of startups, consulting, freelance contracting. I also have my own kind of mentorship program as well that maybe I'll plug at the end. And also write a lot on Medium, and I post like kind of almost daily design tips on Instagram. So feel free to follow me there.
And what is your Instagram?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's at richard.ux. You can find links to everything within my Instagram as well.
Perfect. Thanks for sharing. Richard, let's dive into things. The reason that I pinged you in particular is because you've got like a unique focus, like you're laser focused on interaction design, and you like super get into the details on your work. I've seen a lot of your professional work as well as a lot of the concept work that you post. Can you maybe start us at a really high level on what interaction design is, where it plugs into the design process, and just what it even is?
Sure. So interaction design is like a very, very complex and diverse field. So any definition you find online is going to be either overly generic because of the breadth, or it's going to be so complicated that it doesn't even sound like human language. So simply speaking, and maybe I'll go into like the exact details because I feel like it's more important on like what it encompasses and the exact definition. But loosely speaking, interaction design is the system exchange between a user and the system as a user tries to accomplish a specific goal. So like very high level, most people think of interaction design as like user flows and the number of clicks or user inputs required to complete a task. But today I'm hoping to touch on some of the other aspects, primarily the mental aspect, and also other factors like how words, visual, physical objects in space, time, and behavior can be incorporated into your design process. Um, in terms of, yeah, the design process overall, interaction design is like kind of like one of the big three skill sets every modern designer needs to have, which are product thinking, interaction design, and visual. Generally, like process for design has always been very kind of like subjective to the actual project you're working on. But I usually take like a macro top-down approach, starting at product strategy. So that includes like context gathering, research, competitive analysis, going into information architecture, which is loosely overlapped with interaction design, and then finally visual, and then like, you know, any of the post launch stuff that you have to support with. I don't know if you have a similar kind of process here, Yuri.
I do. I think that was pretty comprehensive. Thank you. You're good.
Where was I? Yeah, so the foundational kind of concept to understand for interaction design is interaction cost, which is the sum of all physical and mental efforts required by a user to complete a task. And the biggest misconception I've seen kind of got circulated as like two big rules, which are like design everything above the fold and keep every core action within 3 clicks, which I think is like kind of like a gross like generalization of what interaction design actually is. Um, so loosely speaking, I guess very high level in terms of like the physical interaction cost, which is all the physical inputs required by the user to complete a task. And generally, like you'll see overlaps with like information architecture, like how complex and spiraling is like your sitemap and the number of screens or hierarchy, how that's organized. Another kind of concept is like the metrics related to task analysis. So if you look at the usability metrics associated with that, which are, you know, the time spent on a task, the success rate of a task, and also the directness of a task, which is like, do they accomplish what they need to do in one go, or is there like a lot of back and forth and confusion along the way? So that's kind of like very high level on the physical part. I want
Mhm.
to do a deep dive on the actual mental interaction costs, because I feel like this is the kind of biggest black box that most new designers don't really consider when they're doing interaction design. So loosely speaking, mental interaction costs can be split into three kind of buckets. The first one is attention, the second one is memory, and the third one is called a conceptual model. So in terms of attention, basically what this means is anytime your user is distracted while completing their task, it's eating away at their mental interaction costs, and it's increasing or decreasing the usability of your product. A lot of that is related to, the visibility and discoverability of some of the key elements required to complete a task within your interface. And a lot of that can be improved or kind of analyzed from a visual hierarchy and emphasis perspective. What this means is like, is your interface or experience drawing the user's attention to the right things? And you can accomplish this with like, yeah, like I mentioned, visual hierarchy, like increasing typography, using colors, illustration, even like motion, sounds, animation, etc. Um, and then also kind of like how accessible is it from like a navigation perspective? Like a common kind of I guess pattern that emerged, I think like a couple years ago, was jamming everything into a hamburger menu.
Mhm.
A lot of people preferred it because like, it was very minimal, it was nice, and you essentially didn't have to worry about information architecture. But that obviously comes at a huge trade-off with discoverability and visibility in the system. So that's an example of kind of one thing to consider on the attention side. In terms of how to evaluate attention, this is usually very expensive, but it's called a eye tracking study. There's a lot of platforms online that can do it. A little hack that I actually do is
Mhm.
I take like my UI, I project it on a screen with a projector, and then I get my participant to wear a hat with a laser pointer strapped onto it. And that kind of works. You don't get very quantitative metrics, but it's a very hacky and cheap way to get a sense of where people are looking. So in terms of like eye movement, there's two types of eye movements. One is called a fixation, which means like they're focusing on one area. And usually in an eye tracking study, that shows up as like a heat map. And then there's a saccade, which is like a rapid movement of the eye
Mhm.
darting from like different locations on the screen. So essentially, when you do evaluate the attentional aspects of your design, you want to see where people are looking. Are they looking in the right places, and are they getting distracted? Um, Kind of related to this concept is like natural reading patterns. The two most common ones in Western culture is Z shape and F shape. Won't go too much into detail about that, but happy to jump back in if there's questions. So the next kind of big aspect I talked about is memory. So generally, you don't want people to remember a lot of things in order to complete your task because, again, very, very huge mental interaction costs. Generally, people are really bad at recalling things. They're much better at recognition. So you want to use, consistent visual patterns, icons with labels, and you want to keep like a lot of like, the interaction patterns consistent and recognizable by providing the right cues up front. I'll kind of touch more on this topic on the conceptual model portion, but the two kind of other really common memory concepts is Miller's Law, which is magic number 7 plus minus 2. This has loosely been debunked, but I think it is still kind of a good framework to keep in mind that, human memory has like a RAM in terms of like their short-term memory, like how many items can they hold at one given time. And a common kind of technique to kind of work with Miller's law is called chunking, which means like placing um, different parts of information in related groups so it's easier to memorize and recall. And then the third kind of concept I want to quickly touch on is Hicks' law, which is the decision time when they're making a decision within your interaction increases exponentially with the number of choices that the user is forced to make. So you can improve this by kind of providing recommendations, using hierarchy to draw them to like the most common kind of patterns and interactions. You can add in constraints and guardrails, use things like progressive disclosure, error prevention, etc., to kind of keep them focused on the like the kind of like core elements they need to put their attention on while completing a task. That's a lot so far, but let me
It
know.
is. I think you just compressed an entire boot camp into about 5 to 7 minutes.
Yeah, I'm actually,
We are getting people in the chat saying that they want an actual presentation around this, so we might have to do a part 2 where you get to do some slides or something.
yeah, for sure. I actually have like just this morning, 10 minutes before this conversation, I just like wrote out all the concepts I can think of, and I created like a diagram of how they're connected. And the plan is eventually I'll kind of turn this into like a article series or like a Substack or something. So
Okay.
keep an eye out on that. But I'd love to go into more detail for like a different session.
Yep.
Um,
What was the third? What
the
was the third part?
conceptual model. So this is actually a very interesting one. They're all kind of loosely overlapped. One kind of one caveat I want to explain first is that, like you don't have to memorize all of these. And like, I'm basically just inferring like my relationship understanding of all these concepts. And you might intuitively know a lot of these things. You just might not know the technical term for it. So that's totally okay. Like the whole point of this conversation isn't like, here's 50 psychological concepts for you to memorize. It's more of like, have an understanding and appreciation of what this is and figure out how to apply it to your design process and your type of work. Because a lot of this stuff like might be more or less valuable depending on like the industry, who you're designing for, the exact type of product, etc. So sorry, that was the caveat, which I probably should have said first, but onto the concept of the conceptual model. So when we design an interface as designers, we're not really able to like fully communicate or give them instructions on what we're thinking. Obviously we can, but it's very bad UX to have like a giant README or very long tutorial on how to use your product. So the kind of best way we can kind of create like associations and cues for our users is called a design model. And really good interaction design is if you can map a design model to a mental model of your user. So a lot of people don't know what mental models are, or there's a misconception on what it is, but very high level, a mental model is like a mental depiction or kind of like a understanding. I'm trying to explain it without using the word model, but it's like a
I love that you're touching on this. I recommend that you use like an example.
yeah. Okay.
Like pick a design problem and then create 3 mental models to support that design problem.
Sure. Okay. Let me add just one sentence to kind of frame the context, but it's basically your expectations around how something works based off your prior experiences. So let's take restaurants, for example. In Western cultures, in non-cultural kind of like settings, when you go to a restaurant, you pay at the end, and then you aren't supposed to like raise your hand. Like the waiter has to come to you, and then that's how you kind of interact. But if you go to like a Chinese restaurant, for example, it's more common to like raise your hand like this. Even though it's like rude in like Western culture, that's an example of a mental model, because when you go into that restaurant, depending on what it is, based off your prior experiences, you have expectations around how it should act. So similarly for user interfaces and product experiences, based on like, how that's presented, users will have a mental model of how they expect it to work. So when you deviate too far away from established mental models of your users, which are subjective and specific to your audience, with your design model, then that's when that conflict occurs, and your users will need like more processing power to actually figure out how things work, and especially if they have to like fight against like common conventions. So I have some sub points for these, but let me know if that made sense to you, Yuri, and if there's anything.
That makes a ton of sense. I'd love to just like add to it for 1 second. Is that like is that a lot of the time it's not as straightforward as just like saying, okay, like here's how customers use a product, so here's exactly the mental model that we'll choose, and then you chase that single mental model down. Something that I've found really helpful is to actually, in early stages of design, go through like a workshop or like ideation phase of just like generating as many mental models as you can,
Yes.
so that there's no stone left unturned, right? So this isn't about like understanding your user so perfectly that you just come up with a genius design and you're off to the races. Like a lot of the time, like I found that like something really effective is to literally think of every mental model that you can. Like, what are all the fundamentally different experiences and ways that you can optimize for a super specific type of user, and then create the mechanisms to start culling that list of mental models until you've done enough discovery and you have enough inputs that have very clearly pointed to like, here's the mental model that matches best to the user. Because like a lot of the time you won't have all the data that you need to identify like who the user is that you're even designing for. A lot of the time you're getting that information in parallel with when you've started to do design. But that all great points, Richard.
Yeah, yeah, you brought up some great points yourself. So I just wanted to kind of add on to that is, yeah, like every type of user, like depending on who they are, their age demographic, the technologies they use, like the specific location they are geographically, the cultures they're accustomed to, they're going to have different mental models. So it's very important to kind of understand them and collect as many as possible, because they serve as a very powerful and good starting point, especially when you have to create brand new patterns from scratch that don't really exist. If you can
Mm-hmm.
find a mental model in the real world that your audience can resonate with, you can use that to kind of create like a UI equivalent. Like when Apple first created like the iPhone, it was very, very heavy on skeuomorphism, right? That is a type of
Mm-hmm.
mental model of, like when we add these like bevels and drop shadows to like mimic like what it looks like in 3D space, like that is a mental model. Even how the iBooks app works, where you have to like swipe, like turning pages, that's also a mental model. So yeah, very, very powerful stuff. Two things to kind of like add on to that mental model is the concept of natural mapping. And essentially what that means is you want the user action or input to be as closely related or arranged similarly to the output as much as possible. And I know that was a bad explanation, so I'm gonna do an example. So, like those like electric like stove tops that are usually arranged in like a 2x2 like grid. A
Yep.
really good kind of natural mapping is you have the controls for all the burners arranged in that same 2x2 format. And then now contrast that with like all those arranged in a line, you would have no idea which one maps to which
Mm-hmm.
stovetop. So that's an example of a mental model. Similarly, when you have like, lists in design, for example, you want like, the overflow, like the 3 dot icon to be like closely situated on the element that it's like affecting. That's also an example of natural mapping. Um, and then one more concept on the mental model is a concept of feedback. Anytime a user does any sort of action, like your system needs to register it and give the user feedback on what's happened. So Don Norman goes into this whole complex thing about like the gulf of execution and the gulf of evaluation. I can do like literally another 1 hour topic just on that, but those are the key words for you guys to look up if you want to look inside into more detail. I guess can throw a few other words for the design model is, the concept of consistency. You want a lot of your interactions, your patterns, your visual cues, patterns are used to be very consistent, because that built into your design model. And next time the user kind of stumbles across it, they have like a heuristic or mental shortcut or expectation on how that's supposed to work if they've come across it once. And that's also roughly related to the whole recognition over recall concept that I mentioned earlier. And related to this as well is the idea of like learnability and Jacob's law. I'm trying really hard to compress a lot of information, but um,
So, I think you've covered a ton of ground here, and I want to up level to a different flavor of question, and
sure.
think we'll make this one of the last ones.
Okay.
Is like you've covered a ton of ground here, right? And you've talked about a ton of theory. we touched on psychology, we touched on technique, like you gave some practical advice on how to do more within design process.
Mhm.
You're self-taught, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, me too. I would love for you to speak to that for a second, because a lot of people watching this are kind of on the fence with like, I've been teaching myself. Should I go to school? Should I do a boot camp, et cetera, et cetera? Like, your stuff is brilliant. Can you speak to like a little bit of your journey and just like how you've been approaching teaching yourself UX,
Sure.
and how you've been able to kind of build up so much knowledge so quickly?
Mhm. Yeah, God, that's a very good question, and please stop if I start rambling. But like every kind of millennial Asian kid growing up, like our parents are like, go be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer. And then I hated school growing up. So I went to university with pre-med and I really, really hated it. Like I couldn't really, find any enjoyment or value in anything I was learning because I couldn't apply it to anything. And I was very lucky to go to like a very techy university. So I got exposure to like a lot of friends who worked in tech. And like the whole concept of like, building a product, having ownership, being creative was like mind blowing to me. And back then, like user experience design or design in general wasn't such a big thing. Um, so I started off programming and, I wasn't very good at it, but I was just like, you know what, I'm just gonna make an app because I just want to apply everything I've learned into like this one thing that I can constantly like see the improvement of. So I was making an app and then at that point, I just thought engineers would make the UIs. So I was like trying to like, code the UI in my head. And obviously that doesn't work really well. So I'm like, okay, like let me try and like design this. And I just like stumbled upon Sketch. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so much fun. And then I just saw myself like skipping classes, not paying attention. I was just like designing like just random UIs of like what I found online like every single day for like, 10 hours. And I was like, this is actually really fun. And then I was like, I kept remaking my app over and over and over again. And anytime like something bothered me, I'm like, why does that bother me? Like what, like, is it the typography? Is it the color? And then I would do like a deep dive and like read up on it and then try and apply that back into my design. And then I started this thing called the Daily UI Challenge, which is like a website now that you can like sign up for. I ended up doing that daily UI challenge 4 times. So that's like 400 days, 400 pieces of UI. And so I kind of hit a plateau and I'm like, okay, like my visual design's like good now. What else is there? And then luckily at that point, I was working with a lot of startups and I had the chance to like lead a project at Shopify. And then I'm like, okay, now there's like this whole like product thinking aspect that I didn't really think
Mhm.
about. And then I was like, okay, like the usability and the numbers and the conversion and like I'm not hitting my North Stars suck because people keep dropping off. And that's when I stumbled upon interaction design and got like super, super deep at like a very micro level of like optimizing the click-through rate of every single screen. And then, I had a lot of hypotheses I looked up, which like led me to finding a lot of these like laws and principles and figuring out how to apply that back to my project. So I guess, I ended up rambling anyways, but the best way to learn is like project-based learning. Um, like you need to kind of like undo the PTSD of school where like, there's grades, there's a curriculum, like you have to read this book, do this course in this order. Like that doesn't really exist, or like I don't think that's the best way to learn, at least not for me. I think you should have a project that you're really passionate about. Ideally, it's in a niche that solves like a high value problem, usually related to growth, like user acquisition and retention, or revenue, like profit generation and cost saving. And just go super deep, create your case studies that go like really, really deep on like very specific problems and learn whatever you need to do to like solve that problem. Like too many like new grad portfolios I always screen are like, hey, I graduated from boot camp. Like, here's like my 3 projects. It's a Yelp redesign, a Spotify redesign, a Facebook redesign. And the goal is to just improve usability. Like, that's obviously not how design works in real life. it's all very focused on solving like an actual problem with like real metrics. And once you kind of get into that mindset and like force yourself to learn the skills that you need to learn, then you become like a high value designer with like a unique set of skills that are like optimized for solving like specific problems within like an industry. And that's like the best way to kind of get your foot in the door.
So what I'm hearing is that even though we spent a ton of today like diving into a lot of really nitty gritty
Mhm.
theory, like really the thing that really propelled you forward was practice, 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 practice. And for you though, it wasn't practice because it sounds like you were actually having fun and enjoying doing it and like just learning on the go. So I hope the group got that out of everything that we've covered today, because we kind of did it backwards, right? We started with the really complicated stuff and then we kind of simplified a little bit, but like you built a very successful career across like a bunch of household name brands solely based off the fact that like you just obsessed over like doing the actual craft, doing the design for a long enough period. And then when you finally realize that, hey, like I got the visual design thing and my stuff looks pretty good, I want more, that's when you dove into the theory and you learned that bit by bit. And like you are like a walking design encyclopedia. Like I feel like if I could turn you into like a portable product and have you in a meeting, just like it's amazing that you've built up um, this like personal knowledge. But I just don't want, like for those listening, I hope you guys were tracking how he got to this point, right? So like make sure that like on top of the theory and books, because just in chat there was a lot of chatter around like, well, what book am I supposed to read about this, right? Like you'll figure out which book to read once you're trying to solve the problem and you hit a wall.
Mhm.
So just go and try to solve some problems. So like whether you want to choose a prompt like Richard said, or you want to go do some freelance work, just whatever it is, make sure that you've got design work that you're doing daily, whether or not you got a job.
Yeah, great point. That's actually a very good crystallization of the advice. I do want to iterate that, like, don't follow my path exactly. Don't follow anyone else's path. Like, do what's actually interesting and engaging for you. Like, my approach, maybe it's coming from a science background, is like, I like to load up on theory and then figure out how to apply it. And it also gives me a lot of confidence in like convincing stakeholders, right? That's my personal
Mm-hmm.
style of design. That's not for everyone. Some people are more intuitive. Some people are very like heavy on the data. Some people are heavy on the research. It's just kind of, you know, do like just practice, like apply it and like pick out the pieces that work for you and like the format and style that you enjoy. Don't force yourself to read books if you don't like books. Like some people just don't learn like that.
Mm-hmm.
When I first started, like I could not get through the principles of design book. I thought it was like the driest thing ever. But like once I kind of had a project to apply it to, then it became much easier. Last kind of comment on books is like don't read them in order. Read snippets and only take out what you need and apply it, because anything that you force yourself to read without applying, like it's not going to stick. Sorry, and
Yeah,
read.
totally. So I think we're gonna start wrapping up this leg. But one more question for you, Richard, is just to kind of tie a bow around this. Do you have any specific tips around how designers can improve their interaction design skills without going into interaction design specific bootcamp?
Sure. So I think like this is a technique that I personally use. It's called interaction cost fixing. You can do it with your own project, or you can do it with any existing product out there. Take every single screen that you can find, including the different error states, the different modes, map it out, connect all the arrows, and then write a interaction cost value and a physical cost value on top of each arrow, and try and like explain why and come up with areas of improvement. And generally, when you do start design, like um, don't kind of only create the happy path, which is like the ideal user flow. Keep edge cases and scenarios in mind. Keep transitions and animations in mind, like the experience between screens. factoring in things like, delays, loading times, data fetching, backend validation. And then lastly, like, don't neglect the visual and content aspects of interaction design, because they serve as like kind of like pillars for your design conceptual model. And also they can provide like very powerful cues to guiding the user to the right step and drawing their attention in the right way. Yeah, hope that helps.
That does. Thanks, Richard. All right. Reminder to everyone, we are going to be moving into Q&A. So in the bottom toolbar on Zoom or in comments or wherever you're watching this, feel free to plug in specific questions. The ones that we'll definitely get to are the ones that are voted up the highest on the Facebook event on the poll. So we'll give folks a couple minutes to get their questions in to, again, the poll inside of the event, as well as the Q&A widget on Zoom. But while you're all doing that, I'd like to pass the mic over to my friend Jordan Robinson. He's a member of our group on UX career support. Jordan, I'd love to give you the mic for a couple minutes in honor of Black History Month. I think you've got something prepared.
Sure, thank you.
And one last thing is that
Okay.
the reason I've asked Jordan specifically is that he's also a fellow mentor. So I recommend that you all connect with him. And he's kind of finding a niche and being super specific about helping minorities succeed. So Jordan.
Thank you so much. Real quick, just a small intersection. I would love to talk about how I got my career started, but that's not what I'm going to talk about. I am also self-learned, self-taught. So anywho, so I have a story that really explains everything why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I have been a designer for more than 13 years across 5 states, 4 regions, and dozens of jobs, like 50 plus. My life in design doesn't always require very much from me, just go to work, do your jobs, come home. But one day I started to wonder how many people I had worked with over the years. How many of them could I remember? Could I remember their names? Could I remember their impact on me? Did they have an impact on me? And if I died today, would any of my coworkers really care? Or if I found out that anyone else died, would I care? That's when it really hit me that we spend so much time working with people who matter to the job, but we don't really remember them for after a few weeks or a few months or even a few years. That's when I decided to change the way I look at life. I want to matter beyond this job, beyond this design. I want to have some real impact. I want to really be here. I started really investing in my relationships with people by remembering their names, remembering their stories. I decided that if I'm going to be here, I'm really going to be here. The beauty of humanity is how we are all here, but we're all different. We all have unique gifts, preferences, styles, and things that we can offer individually. I decided to be more than just another designer. I'm a man with a unique view of this world, with something that only I can contribute in a way that only I can. I decided to be a career coach because I want us to stop being just an input on a spreadsheet or another row down this resource sheet, and I want us to start being individuals again. Let's start using our natural gifts and our personal genius to truly make a stand wherever we work. Um, it's about celebrating and loving our humanity because it's a gift to even be here when so many of us have been lost in the last year, last month. This is a time when social injustice and racism has become more transparent than all the years before. This is also a time when our entire existence, our race as a species, is being threatened. It's time to start seeing the bigger picture. We are people making things for me and other people's benefits. That means I matter, you matter, and we matter because humanity matters. And without that, nothing else will matter. That's my speech. So you guys can reach me Right now, I don't have my full website up, but you can reach me on Facebook at Jordan Robinson 88 or on LinkedIn at Jordan-D-Robinson. That's all I have to say.
Everybody, please do connect with Jordan, especially on LinkedIn. Shoot him a note. Thank him for taking the time to crystallize his thoughts around that. I give him a pretty short period of time to do so, and I think that he's done an amazing job. And leverage him as a mentor. Right, I'm excited that he's in the group. He's participating. He's posted videos and stuff. Jordan, thanks for being a part of the community, man.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. All right, moving lastly into Q&A. It's going to be hard to follow up on that, but let's see how we do here. So starting with the top voted questions in the Facebook poll. Are there any specific rules to follow, Richard, when designing an original interface? So it sounds like this is trying to get at, like, when you don't really have a design system, when you have the opportunity to create something new, what are maybe some like basic guidelines that you consider?
Yeah, that's a great one. I think like a lot of my advice is going to center around the conceptual model aspect. You want to kind of like, don't reinvent the wheel, kind of take the tried and true proven methods and use that as a good starting point. Like a lot of the interaction patterns and the UI elements for the vast majority of use cases are already very well defined. So creating anything from scratch when you don't have a really good reason to is usually not going to be a productive use of your time. Like I think with the explosion of like, material design recently throughout the years, that's like a really good starting point in kind of considering all the factors, making sure you have your bases covered and using like the established patterns that like most people that use digital products are already familiar with. I don't know if that's a good enough answer, but happy to elaborate too if there's a follow-up.
No, I think that's a great point. To add to that, be very conscious of like what the primary device is, like how is it actually going to be used and what operating system is it going to be on, right? So I think some common mistakes people make are like, maybe they'll be working on an actual native Windows or Mac client that's not just a website, but they'll be referring to like material design guidelines and effectively making a website when they should be referring to like Windows Fluid guidelines and considering how to build natively for a client. So just to add to that, I would say like make sure that you're being very conscious about what the actual operating system and context is inside of which you are designing, and then build off of those really mature patterns, as opposed to just always trying to do everything from scratch because you've got a clean sheet of paper on Sketch.
Yeah, just to add one more quick thing to that is, yeah, like follow the conventions as well established by the operating system. Like very common examples of people not doing this was like back maybe like 5-6 years ago, Android used hamburger menus and iOS used tab bars. And anytime you swap them between interfaces, that's introducing like more mental interaction costs because of the dissonance in the conceptual model. Sorry, I lost my other. And also floating action buttons by Material Design and Google. Like they shouldn't really be used in iOS because it's not really a conventional pattern. And also like to consider the. Sorry,
times are tough out there, huh?
I know. Awkward.
Hamburger menus and toolbars, Android and iOS.
Yes. And also I was touching on this earlier, but like there's like 5 dimensions of interaction design. Like the words visual, like that's pretty straightforward. The 3 additional ones, which are kind of related to what you're talking about, is physical objects in space. So that one is looking at the input devices specifically on each platform. For example, desktop, you have the mouse. On mobile, you have your fingers. But you also want to consider assistive technology for accessibility reasons. Like some people use special pointers because of like, physical disabilities or motor impairments. Some people with like mental disabilities, like they need certain fonts or they need certain like contrast ratios. And also even consider like the physical context of like how your users are using your product. A really great example I've seen a while ago was like an app designed for new mothers. And that entire app was designed with the idea that they would be able to use it with one hand because the other hand was likely like holding the baby, which I thought was like a really brilliant and smart and human-centric way to kind of apply that. There's more factors too, but I'm not going to talk about those. So I'll go back to your question.
I think another question that will I think cover several questions here is, can you recommend maybe 2-3 specific resources or books, including your Instagram, because there's a ton of value there, for like learning some that'll get people started down the path of all this theory that you've been covering?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So to be honest, when you approached me for this talk, I was like, all right, cool. Let me find some resources online to kind of jog my knowledge. I actually didn't see that many good ones. They're either way too technical to like a scientific paper kind of level, or they're way too general. So I don't know if it's like a shameless plug, but I literally was like, all right, like let me just write my own version. So I have like a Medium article on interaction cost. I have a note on the 5 dimensions of interaction design. And I'm planning to write a note this weekend on kind of like how to approach interaction design in your process. I can plug those, but if you really, really don't want to read that, I haven't used this personally, but I've heard good things about the interaction design foundry or foundation. It's the diagram with the little tree on it, black and white.
Yeah, I recommend that one a lot.
Yes. So that would be a good place to start if you wanted to go super deep. And then if you had to read a book, Don Norman's Principles of Design has a lot of the mental interaction costs and principles, but I feel like it's a bit too dry. I think the summaries are good enough, but it's up to you.
It's definitely not a shameless plug, and I'll make sure to update all the descriptions around this event, and so that people can easily get to those links. Regarding where to find all that, folks, like I said, I'll just put it into the event descriptions, and I'll also shoot it out as an email to everyone that registered. All right, cool. Next question. Sorry, there's a lot. I'm trying to pick out the best ones. Can you explain why some designers specifically have the title of interaction designer? Like, what does it mean when someone is specifically an interaction designer versus a UX designer?
That's a great question. So I don't think interaction designer is actually you. So there's the whole concept of a specialist and a generalist, and then now this new T-shaped model that's going around. I'll try and explain the differences. So let's say 10 years ago, companies only hired specialists. They hired one person really, really good at one craft. And that came in the forms of information architect, UI designer, visual designer, interaction designer, etc. And then in the past, like maybe 3 to 4 years, that shift to generalist. So basically that means that you need to kind of know everything, but not as deep. And I think a lot of that was due to like the rise of startups, which kind of couldn't hire multiple specialists, but also like the approach of like more holistic design where, one designer or design team considers everything holistically instead of like working on each aspect of the design in silo. And then now the new model, which is called T-shape, which is like a mixture of both, which is like you want to be a generalist, but you want to specialize in certain areas that are specific to the types of prompts and spaces you want to operate in. So I think the only big company that still has an interaction design title is Google. And here is my hypothesis. I don't know if this is right or wrong, but in terms of the big 3 skill sets, startups will always like heavily favor visual and interaction design because they need more executional work, and you usually have very close proximity to I don't know, have a really close proximity to the founders, the CEOs, and leadership. Whereas like more mature companies and corporations, they're going to heavily favor people with product thinking skills and interaction design skills. with visual design being less important because they tend to have very robust design systems and it's more about how to apply design. And product thinking is such a hard and ethereal concept to grasp, and that space is kind of owned by product managers already. So I feel like it might be like a branding or perception thing. So like Google and other companies that have interaction designer as a title, they're probably just like using that to specifically target the type of designers that they need. But that doesn't mean that like, you know, you should only learn interaction design. You still need to know the other aspects. It's more kind of like a company's choice and like how they want to do their recruiting strategy. That is my hypothesis. I don't know if that's correct or not, but I'm happy to hear your thoughts too, Yuri.
No, but I would just add that I believe Amazon also specifically does interaction designers, but I generally see that role being more on like interaction heavy products. So like there's a lot like in hardware, things that have like proprietary screens, things that like really lean heavily into transitions, because like an interaction designer can very easily just focus for 3 months on a very specific transition, you know, which is which, you know, deep diving into something like really motion heavy and very isolated, as opposed to like working on an end-to-end workflow.
Oh yeah, one more thing to add is I think voice designers, AR, VR, anything in emerging tech, anything that touches multiple touch points, those problem spaces I feel like would be very, very heavy on the interaction design domain. And you might see that title for those types of surfaces specifically.
Yeah. You touched on design systems there for a second. Can you speak to like when do you actually get to the design system? Like, you know, when you're thinking about mental models, like, is it at the mental model level? Is it like once you've already decided things and you go into a higher fidelity? When do you jump into creating a design system?
So I think design system is kind of like a UX buzzword that kind of blew up in the past couple of years. And a lot of people are creating design systems when they don't need design systems, or when creating design systems actually slower. Rule of thumb is if you're working with more than one designer, you should have a system, but there's different degrees of like robustness. Within a design system, you know, the more tactical pieces are like a style guide and a UI sticker sheet. Usually that's all you need, and you don't need the whole like philosophy and the content, the voice and the tone until you're much bigger and further along. So I think like when you're considering like your mental model, your consistency patterns, and trying to create that like system that users will expect that's actually consistent, anytime you have a component that you use more than once, just create like all the different states for it and keep that consistent, use it as much as possible, and be very hesitant when you have to create a new pattern that deviates away from the system you already have. Because yeah, generally you want to keep your components as like, you know, as concise as possible without adding too many, because that's just like more things for users to learn. Yeah, in most cases though, like I think like you just need a sticker sheet, which is just like a big artboard of all your components and states.
Which is a very basic design system, because like you are aligning on some very basic styles, right? I think that the like the important thing is that you're keeping redundancy to a minimum. And to use buttons as an example, you don't have 4 primary buttons. So as long as you're doing that, you're like you have the beginnings of a design system. So I guess to Richard's point, it depends on the complexity of the product and also its maturity. So interaction design can very easily like add a lot of scope to a project, especially if you're in-house. Do you have any tips around how to get engineering and partners excited about some of the nuances of interaction design?
Sure, that's a great question. So let me preface this by saying that, you know, like generally, you know, as designers, we want a lot of feedback. Really good designers are really good at taking feedback, but also teaching the team how to give really good feedback. That's like the key here. Generally, like nobody's gonna have an opinion on like how code is written aside from engineers, but everyone will always have an opinion on design because it's visual. and everyone feels like they can comment on it. So a lot of the times the feedback you get is purely on visual, which can be frustrating, especially if you're approaching it from an interaction design path first before you fill in like the visual details. So what I usually try and do is like try and educate the team that I'm working with on like, here are all the interaction design factors that, we should consider, help me kind of fill in the gaps. And this is specifically what I want feedback on. Like framing it that way is really important. My common practice is like I grayscale my designs when it's in the interaction design stage. I don't want to focus only on that and like, ask really good questions. Like don't just say like, what do you think about my design? Be like, do you think I'm missing any edge cases? What do you think about the physical interaction costs of this? Do you think attention is being drawn in the right way? And a lot of that is like educating the team you're on. And once they understand like the intricacies of it and what to look out for, it almost becomes like a game. To kind of like spot the little inconsistencies. And you have to kind of, come from like a very humble position too. Like, like you're not like, coming and say like, I'm the designer that just defined the interaction and like what I say goes. Be like, hey, here's my best shot based off the existing patterns I know. Here are the things that I'd like to consider. Can you help me kind of like spot these little inconsistencies, areas of improvement, help me evaluate these trade-offs? And I think if you involve them that way, the feedback you get is gonna be a lot more useful, and the team will genuinely be much more excited to kind of work with you on that interaction design piece.
Great answer. I think we got time for one more question. I'm gonna go with Helen's question. How did pretty much how do you manage burnout? So it sounds like you're doing a lot of work right now, right? And you're managing your Instagram, which has gotten a lot of momentum, and you're writing on theory. Like I have to imagine that you've been burned out for a couple of years. You're just still going. So how do you manage all that?
That's a good question. Yeah. So I've done so much like reflection on like burnout. I have two pieces of advice. So I feel like people within like our generation are the one above and below. Like we have this obsession with productivity. And a lot of the times we force ourselves and push ourselves to like be productive, even when like our mind, body, and soul like aren't ready to be productive. And the burnout happens when like you force yourself to work, when like you're not going to produce good work. So my friend introduced this concept of like productive input to me, and you have to balance it too. So productive output is like the work you actually produce. Productive input is like the things that like kind of recharge you and give you inspiration. And once I kind of like saw productive input as productive, I was able to like weave those in strategically when they made sense. And that helped kind of like balance a lot of the burnout for me. The second kind of piece I want to kind of touch on is the idea of motivation. So again, classical psychology theory, there's intrinsic motivation, which means like you want to do it yourself for you. And
Yes, I am.
Hey, Jordan. So I'm gonna switch gears here for a second. And you mentioned earlier that you're also self-taught. I'd love to use the last couple minutes to actually, if it's not too much to ask, I know I'm kind of hopping on you last second here. Would you be willing to share your story of how you taught yourself?
Sure. My story is quite particular. So I'll try to go through it really quickly. So it all started with, I was in film school. I didn't even focus on design. I didn't even know about the design industry as a whole. I knew how to design, but I didn't know about it. So through a number of things, I dropped out of film school and I needed to find a way to make money. So I started doing photography because I knew how to handle my camera. And from photography, doing that stuff for people, then all of a sudden people start asking for flyers. And I'm like, oh yeah, I can do that. I need money. I'm just gonna try to keep making things go. And so I just started doing flyers, and then they started asking for logos, and I was like, oh, I can do that too. Definitely still need money. And then after that, somebody like asked me for a website, which I knew nothing about. No HTML, no CSS, no WordPress, no nothing. But I just threw myself in the fire, and I was just like, you betcha, buddy, I got you. And I just kind of jumped.
Man after my own heart.
Yeah, so I mean, but I got lucky because honestly, I didn't know where I was going to go. But this guy that was in this meeting where I said yes, I could do the website. This guy was like, "Hey, man, dude, I work for Apple. There's this new kind of software you can use if you want to use it." And, I didn't want to come off like I didn't know anything. So I was just like, I mean, I got my own processes usually, but yeah, I'll check your stuff out. You just save my, you know what. And so from there, I started like, it was really like an animation thing. It's called Tumult Hype. It's like something like one of the Apple people, the giant engineers or whatever. And so from there, I did that, and then cut through for like 5 years of doing like stuff for people. I had to jump from New Jersey to Seattle, which I talk about in one of my other videos. And then from there, I just kind of kept picking up. So I have a snowball career because I started off going there in the ad agency, did some stuff there. Then I started learning about UX and started reading about it. And then I got thrown into a UX role for like this hospital. It's just like, hey, we want you to help us with our redesign our intranet. And I was like, holy crap, I don't know anything. But so
but yeah, I could do it.
I can do it. I just kept doing that. And so
yeah, I've designed tons of intranets. I got this.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. So like, I mean, but people kept believing. The more I said yes, more people kept believing in me, even though I didn't prove it. I just had a really nice portfolio. So that's why I'm a huge advocate for the portfolio, because that's how you get into things. If you can wow people with that eye candy, they'll just buy into it. But even if you don't know how to do it. But what I would do is I would study every day, like a notebook. I knew this, I knew that. Google University, and I kept answering problems that were thrown to me. So I kept trying to find out how to do that, and then I would come up with my best pitch on that. And then like whenever it was like, "Are you sure about that?" And it's like, "I think so. Let me check again," and then I just keep learning.
So let me ask you this as we wrap up. Like, how did you put yourself in positions where you were able to step up in the first place? Because I think there's an art to doing that as well, right? Like it's one thing to say, yeah, I'll build an intranet. I've totally done it before when you really haven't. But like, how do you put yourself in a position where you even have the opportunity to be in the same room when that question happens?
A lot of things kind of I wasn't intending to be there. But what happened is I just kept connecting with people, networking with people. And so because I didn't know what recruiters were for the longest time, but it was a recruiter that saw me and then applied me without me really knowing much about it. And so I kind of got just thrown in. But I definitely would say just throw your stuff out there, show your stuff online, throw your portfolio out there, just start getting on LinkedIn. I know about Dice, which is another one, and there's all these different kinds of recruiting websites and companies, and I just put myself out there and people start coming to me. So all for the portfolio, because the portfolio is the eye candy and everybody's like, oh, he must know something. I like this guy.
Yeah, I'm completely with you there. That's like there's no secret, there's no hack. It's just your portfolio needs to be better than the next person's. That's about it.
Pretty much.
All right, Jordan, thanks so much for hanging out with us. Richard, I know you cut out there, but thanks so much for all the value that you brought into the session. I think that people got a lot of value out of this hour. I think we've compressed a solid day worth workshop into whatever it was, 50 minutes. Thank you both for joining us. Jordan, plug your mentor group real quick. What's it called on Facebook?
It's Jordan R Coaching is the group. It's but I'll put it in here because it's
okay, cool. And Richard, what was yours called again?
Let me link mine. I think mine's private. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, mine's private too.
Feel free to also reach out to Jordan and Richard on LinkedIn, and I'm sure that they'll send you the URL. And make sure to follow richard.ux on Instagram. He's got like over 16,000 followers, and like he posts a ton of value, a lot of stories. Like Richard's production value is something that I can only aspire for. I don't think I could hire for that kind of production value. So thanks everybody for joining us. I'll see you all on the Facebook group.
Yeah. Thank you.
See you guys.
See ya.